Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Adana could still remember the first time she met Chuka. It was during a rainy afternoon at the university's cafeteria. He had walked in soaked and smiling, offering to share his umbrella with her after she forgot hers in the library. From that moment, their bond grew like a carefully nurtured flame. Chuka was gentle, attentive, and prayerful, always the first to say "let's pray" before a meal and quick to send her long messages about faith and purity. He told her, "I see a future with you, one where we raise kingdom children." And she believed him. Everyone did. Even her mother called her lucky, whispering prayers of gratitude that her daughter had found a man who feared God and walked with purpose. Their wedding was beautiful, held in a glass chapel with white roses, gold ribbons, and a choir singing, "Great is thy faithfulness." Adana was radiant in her gown, glowing from a heart full of hope. Chuka had promised her a love that would last a lifetime, and as he slid the ring onto her finger, he whispered, "With God, nothing can ever come between us." But the man who made those promises didn't last long after the honeymoon. It began subtly, as abuse often does. First, it was his tone, sharper, colder. He no longer prayed with her at night. He began coming home late, smelling of alcohol and foreign perfume. When she asked him what was wrong, he snapped. Then he started accusing her of monitoring him, of being clingy and ungrateful. On their second anniversary, he told her to stop acting holy when she couldn't even make egusi soup without burning it. That night, he didn't come home. Adana cried herself to sleep on the couch. But she told herself it was stress from work, that marriage had seasons, that every union had trials. She fasted for 3 days and went to the altar with a seed offering. She held on, believing that the Chuka who prayed with her, who wrote her love letters full of scriptures, would come back. But the only thing that returned was his anger, stronger and sharper each time. And as the months passed, the man she loved slowly became a stranger who shared her bed but not her heart. Adana didn't give up. Every insult, every silence, every slammed door was met with more prayers. She kneeled in the corner of their room, whispering scriptures with tears running down her cheeks. She begged God for restoration. Her faith was her weapon, her comfort, her crutch. Friends began to notice the bruises, but she denied everything. "I fell in the bathroom," she would say, "or I'm just tired." Her mother grew suspicious, but Adana always smiled and said, "God is working." To her, endurance was a virtue. Submission was sacred. She wanted to be the wife that pleased the heavens, not the one who walked away. And every time Chuka looked at her with disgust or raised his voice, she didn't see cruelty. She saw a man fighting his own battles. She believed he was lost, and that God had placed her there to be his anchor. She didn't know she was slowly drowning. It was 2 years into their marriage when the worst happened. Chuka had returned home at midnight, reeking of alcohol, stumbling through the hallway. Adana had called him earlier in the evening, just once, to ask if he was still coming for dinner. That call was all it took to enrage him. The moment he walked through the door, he threw the plate of rice she had kept warm for him against the wall. "So now you monitor me?" he roared. She tried to explain, but his hand was faster than her words. He slapped her across the face, so hard she hit the tiled floor, her head spinning. He kicked her twice in the stomach and walked out muttering, "Be useful for once." Adana lay there trembling, her arms wrapped around her belly, the pain growing unbearable. She was 3 months pregnant, their first child. That night, her white nightgown turned red, soaked in blood. She crawled to the bathroom, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to reach her phone. When she finally dialed her neighbor, she could no longer speak. The next thing she remembered was waking up in a hospital bed, her mother sobbing at the foot of the bed. The doctors told her the pregnancy was gone. Her womb had suffered internal trauma. They weren't sure if she'd be able to conceive again. Her mother begged her to press charges. The nurse whispered, "You need to run before he kills you." But Adana, weak and in tears, just asked for her Bible. She didn't even cry when Chuka walked into the hospital days later with flowers and a plastic apology. "I was drunk," he said. "You know I love you." "I didn't mean it." The words were robotic, empty. But Adana nodded, held his hand, and told him she forgave him. She was convinced that the enemy was trying to break their union. She went back home with him, her arms empty, but her heart still clinging to the hope that God would reward her perseverance. That Sunday, she dressed in her best ankara, stood before the church, and thanked God for sparing her life. People clapped. Pastor Vincent nodded. But no one knew the price she had paid to smile on that altar. Later that week, she went to see Pastor Vincent privately. She broke down in his office, telling him everything. She told him about the miscarriage, the beatings, the constant fear. She expected outrage, maybe a plan to intervene. But the pastor only sighed, reached for his Bible, and said, "Sister Adana, marriage is not for the faint-hearted. You must hold on, fast, pray. These men are warriors fighting spiritual battles. If you leave, the devil wins." Then he placed his hand on her head and began to pray, asking God to give her strength to endure. That day, something in Adana cracked. Not entirely, not enough to leave. But deep inside, a quiet doubt took root. Was this what God intended for her? Was endurance the same as silent suffering? Still, she left the office, saying amen. Because at that time, she didn't know she had a choice. Word had spread in church that Adana was fragile, but strong in spirit. Pastor Vincent began using her as an example during marriage seminars. "Look at Sister Adana," he'd say. "Despite her trials, she's still standing. That's a true Christian wife." Meanwhile, Chuka strutted into church like royalty, often late, but always carrying fat envelopes. He was sponsoring the youth auditorium's new speakers, had paid for 3 church member school fees, and even donated 2 million Nigerian nairas for the upcoming church anniversary. The congregation adored him. No one asked about his wife. No one dared. When Adana showed up with a swollen wrist, people whispered, but Pastor Vincent silenced them. "You are not here to judge. You are here to worship." Adana heard it, and she believed it. If she left now, wouldn't she be the one who failed? Then came TOCHI. She entered like a storm, bold, light-skinned, with sharp curves and louder clothes. Chuka met her at a lounge, and before long, she was visiting their home. Adana was instructed to cook for her. TOCHI sat on their couch, scrolling through Instagram while laughing. "Your husband is fine, Shah," she said to Adana without shame. One day, Adana walked into the hallway and saw them kissing. She stood there, stunned, waiting for Chuka to explain. He didn't. Instead, he barked, "If you know what's good for you, go and boil yam." That night, Adana lay in bed beside a man who had just kissed another woman in her home, and all she could do was pray. The next Sunday, Pastor Vincent preached about Jezebels and Delilahs. Adana thought for a moment that he was finally addressing her situation. But then he turned to her and said, "Sister Adana, stand up." She did. "The Lord says you must continue to fight for your home. Let your silence shake the devil." The church clapped. Adana blinked back tears. The applause felt like knives. She wanted to scream. But instead, she sat back down and whispered, "Thank you, sir." Because that's what women like her were taught to do. Endure, not escape. The first time TOCHI walked into Adana's home, it was as though thunder had been invited into a library. She didn't knock. She didn't greet. She didn't ask. She marched in, heels clacking, gum snapping, perfume suffocating the room like smoke from a forest fire. She was everything Adana was not, loud, flashy, and irreverent. Chuka introduced her with a dismissive hand wave, as though she were a housemaid. "This isn't TOCHI," he said, "my friend from town. She'll be staying a few days." And with that, Adana's world tilted. TOCHI dropped her designer handbag on the couch, chewed her gum louder, and smirked at Adana like a queen looking down on a beggar. "Auntie, do you have cold Pepsi?" she asked, without breaking eye contact. Adana, ever the obedient wife, went to the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass. This wasn't just another woman. This was war declared. A war Adana wasn't trained to fight. That night, she served dinner to the two of them, TOCHI wearing one of Adana's wrappers, her legs crossed boldly under the dining table, her voice louder than laughter should ever be in a broken home. In the days that followed, Nkechi became a permanent fixture in the house. She walked around barefoot, singing loudly, using Adana's skincare products without asking. Once, Adana entered the bedroom and found her painting her nails on their matrimonial bed, while Chuka watched TV beside her. No one spoke. Chuka didn't flinch. Nkechi didn't apologize. Adana just stood there, frozen, then turned and walked out. She had grown used to swallowing hurt, but this was something new. It was humiliation dipped in venom, served cold. Nkechi began to call Adana Auntie mockingly, always with a smile. Auntie, is there fish in that soup? I don't eat bony meat. Or, Auntie, why don't you wear wigs? Maybe that's why he got tired. The insult wasn't just in the words, but in the tone, a sneer that peeled away Adana's dignity one layer at a time. Chuka, for his part, grew even colder. He stopped pretending. He no longer needed to. He would tell Adana to adjust to modern life, say things like, "You're lucky I haven't kicked you out yet." But the worst pain wasn't in the insults, it was in the silence. No one came to visit anymore. Not her friends, not her pastor, and certainly not her God, or so it felt. Still, Adana didn't pack her bags. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she cleaned the house more diligently, cooked more meals, fasted more days. She poured anointing oil over her bed, over her head, over the doorpost. She sowed seeds at church and knelt for prayers after every service. She waited for the heavens to move, but all she heard were echoes. One night, after overhearing Nkechi and Chuka laugh about her bush village manners, she wept so loudly that the gate man came to knock on her door. "Madam, are you okay?" he asked. She wiped her tears quickly, smiled weakly, and said, "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Inside, something was breaking, slowly, painfully. And while the world slept, a woman with a scarless face and a fractured spirit whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, give me strength. Or take me in my sleep." Adana had always found solace in the simple act of kneeling by the edge of her bed. In those stolen moments, before dawn broke or after Chuka's latest insult, she would close her eyes and whisper desperate prayers. "Touch his heart, Lord," she would plead. "Return my husband to me." She truly believed that prayer could do what her tears couldn't. But that night, her faith became her curse. Chuka had returned home drunk again. The smell of alcohol and strange perfume filled the bedroom like a fog. She didn't confront him. Confrontation had become dangerous. Instead, she knelt beside the bed and began to pray quietly. Not even aloud, just her lips moving in rhythm with the pain in her chest. But Chuka noticed. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice slurred. "Praying," she replied softly. "For you." That was all it took. He flew into a rage, shouting that she was mocking him, that she was using prayers as a weapon. Before she could respond, his hand landed across her face, so hard she crashed into the dressing table. Her lips split open. Blood smeared the wall. He left her there, walked into the parlor, and turned up the television. She didn't go to the hospital. She didn't scream. She used salt water to clean her wound and covered it with a scarf the next morning. That Sunday, she still went to church. She wore sunglasses and smiled when people greeted her. She led the women's morning prayer, her voice calm, her lips swollen beneath layers of lipstick. Pastor Vincent preached about the power of submission, using verses about Sarah calling Abraham Lord. He locked eyes with Adana mid-sermon and said, "A virtuous woman covers her home, not with gossip, but with grace." Chuka, sitting 2 rows from the front, nodded proudly. He dropped another 100,000 Nigerian nairas in the offering basket. After service, Pastor Vincent pulled Adana aside and said, "Whatever happens, don't stop praying. Your testimony will shake this church one day." She nodded, but the only thing shaking was her spirit. That night, she cried into her pillow until it was soaked. And even then, she whispered prayers. Not for her healing, but for strength to keep holding on. Days later, a close friend, Amarachi, visited and noticed the bruises on Adana's arm. "Adana, this is not godly suffering. This is death in disguise," she whispered. But Adana just smiled and said, "If I walk away, I'll be walking out of God's will." Amarachi stared at her, heartbroken. "Or maybe God already gave you a door, and you're refusing to walk through it." But Adana didn't listen. She couldn't. To her, leaving wasn't courage, it was failure. It meant giving up. It meant the enemy won. She went to bed that night clutching her Bible. But her faith, once a fortress, had become a prison. And yet, still, she stayed. The day Nkechi threw a house party was the day Adana realized that humiliation had no limits. It started with loud music blasting from the speakers, Afrobeats pulsing through the walls like war drums. Adana had returned from the market with soup ingredients when she walked into her home and saw strange women dancing in her sitting room. Nkechi, wearing a tight gown and expensive makeup, held a wine glass and laughed without shame. "Auntie, welcome," she shouted over the music. "We were waiting for you. Can you make that pepper soup now?" Her friends burst into laughter. Adana's hands shook as she carried the food to the kitchen. No one helped her. Chuka sat on the couch, legs crossed, his arms slung casually around Nkechi. He looked at Adana like she was the house help, something forgotten, something tolerated. Adana made the soup. She served it. She cleaned after them. She stayed up scrubbing wine stains from the tiles long after the party ended. And when she entered her bedroom, she found her Bible on the floor, pages torn, cover stained. Chuka had thrown it out in anger because she had refused to bring his mistress an extra spoon during dinner. "You and this your Bible SEF," he spat. "That thing has made you stupid." She picked it up carefully, dusted it, and placed it back on the shelf. She didn't cry that night. There were no tears left, just silence. A long, cold silence that wrapped itself around her like a wet blanket. But silence isn't peace. It's just pain with no sound. Adana knelt, not to pray, but to rest. Even God, it seemed, had stopped listening. The next morning, as she greeted Chuka, he didn't respond. Nkechi stood beside him, sipping tea and smiling wickedly. "You need to try makeup," she said. "At least do something with yourself. You look like pain." Chuka laughed. "She is pain." That laughter stayed with Adana the whole day, like thorns in her mind. She walked around the house like a ghost, cleaning what wasn't dirty, folding clothes already folded. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her reflection. Who was this woman? Where did the laughter go? The songs? The joy? The dreams? Everything was gone, burnt, crushed, buried under the weight of endurance. But somewhere, deep in that silence, a spark flickered. Small, barely visible. But it was there. She didn't know it yet, but her breaking point was coming. And when it came, it would not be quiet. The morning it happened began like any other. The sky was heavy with heat, and Adana had woken early to boil yam and fry eggs for Chuka and his guest, Nkechi. She moved like clockwork, robotic, tired, but still trying. She served breakfast with her head bowed, avoiding the eyes of the woman who had become her humiliation. Nkechi sat at the table, chewing with open contempt. "Auntie," she said, licking her oily fingers, "this egg is dry. Your cooking matches your marriage, tasteless." The girls she had invited for the weekend burst into laughter. Chuka joined them. Adana did not respond. Her chest felt like a block of stone. She turned to leave, clutching the empty tray, when Nkechi whispered something into Chuka's ear. He nodded, his smile fading into a tight-lipped expression. "Adana," he barked, "come back here." She paused in the hallway, heart pounding. He walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and turned on the gas stove. Adana watched, confused, frozen. When the water boiled and steam hissed from the lid, Chuka turned to her and said, "Maybe this will teach you to respect your betters." Before she could process it, the scalding water flew through the air like molten glass. It struck her face, her neck, her chest. Her scream ripped through the house, sharp and raw like a wounded animal. The tray crashed to the floor. The air filled with the smell of burned flesh and something darker, betrayal. Nkechi shrieked in mock horror, pulling out her phone and recording the scene as if it were a comedy. The girls gasped but did nothing. No one called for help. Chuka stood there, staring at his wife, now writhing on the floor, her skin bubbling, peeling, her hands clawing the tiles in agony. "You did this to yourself," he muttered, walking out as if nothing happened. Adana crawled toward the door, her vision blurred by pain and tears. The gate man, hearing the noise, rushed in and screamed at the sight. He picked her up and rushed her into his rickety car. Her blood and burned skin stained the back seat. In the hospital, she passed out 3 times during treatment. The doctors whispered in horror. What kind of monster would do this? One asked. No one knew. No one wanted to know. When she finally regained consciousness days later, her entire upper body was wrapped in white bandages. The pain was unbearable, but worse was the silence. No one had come. Not Chuka. Not Nkechi. Not Pastor Vincent. Not a single member of the church she had served faithfully for years. Only the gate man, Uche, sat by her side, eyes filled with tears. He had no money, but he brought her water, wiped her forehead, and prayed over her in his own trembling voice. When Adana saw her reflection for the first time, half of her face blistered, her skin now a map of pain. Something inside her shifted. It was not rage, not bitterness. It was clarity. She had died that day in the kitchen, not just her flesh, but the woman who waited, who hoped, who begged. What remained was someone new, someone who would never kneel to be hurt again. The healing would be slow, the scar permanent, but the decision was final. She was done dying for a man who wouldn't spit to put out the fire he started. Adana left the hospital under cover of night. She couldn't afford another scandal, another round of pity masked as curiosity. With no money, no phone, and nowhere to go, she wandered until her body gave out on the side of a quiet road, far from the city noise. She collapsed in a ditch, her legs too weak to carry her burned body. That was where Mama Adeobi found her, an old widow known in the nearby village for taking in lost women and orphans. She brought Adana into her home, a modest mud house with wooden shutters and a squeaky metal roof, and laid her on a straw mat covered with worn blankets. The old woman said nothing that night. She simply wiped Adana's face, rubbed a balm made from shea butter and herbs onto her wounds, and hummed to him in a soft, cracking voice. Adana couldn't speak. Her voice had dried with her tears. She lay still for hours, eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. The pain came in waves, but so did the memories, the prayers, the slaps, the laughter that stabbed like blades. Days turned to weeks. Mama Adeobi bathed her, fed her, told her stories of women who survived worse. She didn't ask Adana's full name. Didn't need to. Her eyes said she already knew. "You were married to pain," the woman said one night, as they sat under the mango tree outside. "But God didn't write that vow." Adana finally broke. She cried like a woman who had swallowed screams for years. Her sobs shook her ribs, cracked her voice, and poured out everything she'd buried beneath religion and duty. Mama Adeobi held her until dawn. "You won't return to that," she said. "Not as who you were." And Adana didn't want to. Her reflection in the water basin showed a stranger, scarred, thinner, older. But the woman in her eyes was no longer a victim. She was rising. Slowly, quietly, but certainly. The wound had become her fuel. In the weeks that followed, Adana began healing, mind, body, and spirit. Mama Adeobi introduced her to local craft making, herbal healing, and a community of women who had once been battered and buried by men like Chuka. These women didn't have hashtags. They didn't have lawyers. But they had each other. They sat under trees, shared food, and told the truth without judgment. For the first time in years, Adana laughed. It was a dry laugh, uncertain, but it was hers. She started helping around the compound, braiding children's hair, teaching market women how to keep ledgers and count profits. Her education returned to her like water from a buried well. And with every passing day, the fire in her grew, not just to survive, but to become. She didn't want revenge. Not yet. She wanted freedom. And the journey had just begun. It was in the dusty market square of Nsukka that Adana met Chioma, a widowed trader with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. She noticed Adana helping a vegetable seller count her daily sales and asked, "Who taught you account balance?" Adana replied softly, I studied banking and finance in university. Chioma smiled, tilting her head. And now you're here counting tomatoes? That question could have felt cruel. But Chioma wasn't mocking. She was recruiting. Later that evening, she took Adana to a private gathering behind her stall. 10 women, seated in a circle on plastic chairs, some young, some old, all wearing the same branded wrapper that read, From Grace to Grace. There was no camera, no microphone, no social media. Just stories, hard stories. Women whose husbands broke their jaws. Women thrown out for birthing only girls. Women buried alive in shame. But none of them looked broken. They laughed. They shared strategies. They pooled funds. They built each other back, brick by brick. Chioma explained that From Grace to Grace was more than a group. It was a quiet storm. A movement of women who refused to be defined by pain, but refused even louder to let that pain go to waste. They didn't beg for justice, they became it. They didn't wait for apologies, they built legacies. They invested in one another's businesses, trained each other in digital skills, and organized discreet legal services for battered women who couldn't speak publicly. And best of all, no one knew who led it. There was no president, no face of the movement. Just purpose. Adana joined like a woman entering a new church, except this time, she wasn't kneeling to pray. She was standing to plan. They gave her capital to start a Gary packaging business. Within months, she turned a profit. Chioma mentored her in strategy. Another member taught her coding. And one evening, as she balanced her books and calculated interest returns, Adana whispered to herself, This is power. Years passed. Quietly, Adana built wealth. Not flashy wealth, but layered influence. Land under false names, a stock portfolio in a shell company, and silent partnerships in logistics and agriculture. No one knew her scars anymore. They just knew her results. She had changed her name in official records. She stopped praying for Chuka to repent. She didn't hate him. She simply erased him from the parts of herself that once bled. But deep down, one part of her remained awake, watching, calculating. Not for revenge. Not yet. But for truth. For reckoning. For the moment when the wind would shift and everything taken would return with interest. And when that day came, she would not kneel. She would not scream. She would walk in quietly, with her scar, her smile, and her silence, and own the room she was once thrown out of. Chuka never noticed. When the foundation beneath his life began to crack. His arrogance had grown fatter, while his instincts had withered. He had pushed Adana so far into the background of his mind that he never once imagined she would rise. In his world, she was either dead, broken, or buried in shame. Now he basked in false peace, drinking his imported whiskey in the parlor, sleeping beside Nkechi without guilt, watching football while signing business contracts he barely read. What he didn't know was that one of those contracts bore the silent fingerprints of his past. A newly incorporated company, unknown to him but disguised under an innocent name, had bid for one of his distressed properties during a recent auction. Chuka, desperate to settle debts from tax errors and mismanagement, approved the sale without a second glance. He was unaware that the company was linked to From Grace to Grace, and Adana was its primary silent investor. The very land that once carried the wedding bouquet she dropped in their backyard was now under her name. Nkechi was part of the rot, too. She had grown bored of playing housewife without the ring. The same arrogance she mocked in Adana began to surface in her. She now controlled Chuka's ATM cards, shopped excessively, hosted lavish brunches, and partied on rooftops. When he complained, she screamed louder. "I left everything to be with you," she would yell, even though she came with nothing. He began to lose sleep, haunted by nightmares of a faceless woman pouring boiling water on him, always followed by laughter. He was drinking more, working less, and failing faster. His logistics company missed critical deadlines. Staff resigned without notice. Banks started calling. His face, once admired in the community, began to vanish from social circles. And still, he didn't connect the dots. He didn't wonder where Adana was. He assumed her silence was weakness, Her absence was defeat. But she had only gone underground, to grow, to build, to wait. While he slept, she was buying back her life, one title deed at a time. Then came the eviction notice. It arrived in a white envelope, handed to Chuka by a security man who looked both nervous and apologetic. "Sir, this house now belongs to the new owner." Chuka laughed at first. "What nonsense are you saying?" But when he saw the signatures, his own among them, his laughter died in his throat. Nkechi cursed him for stupidity. "You sold the house we're living in? Are you mad?" Chuka stuttered, flipping through old emails, trying to recall the transaction. And there it was, buried in weeks of ignored documents, a quiet property sale. Panic set in. His assets were melting before his eyes. He called the number on the notice. No one answered. He visited his lawyer, who sighed and said, "Chuka, this deal was clean. The buyer had all the rights." When he asked for the name of the buyer, the lawyer looked puzzled. "Some female investor. Her name wasn't even listed directly. It's all under a blind trust." Chuka didn't know it yet, but he had just been outplayed by the very woman he once boiled. Adana stood outside the gates of the house that once swallowed her tears. The building hadn't changed, same cream paint, same cracked flower pots at the entrance, same metallic gate that once kept her imprisoned. But she had changed. Draped in a tailored navy blue baboo, a black silk scarf loosely covering her hair, and large sunglasses concealing part of her scar, she looked like a quiet dignitary. Behind her, 3 security men and her lawyer waited in silence. She held the title deed in one hand and a new key in the other. "Open the gate," she said softly. The guards complied. Inside, everything was exactly how she left it. The hallway where she had been slapped, the kitchen where she had been scalded, the bedroom where silence became her lullaby. Her footsteps echoed on the tiles. She stood in the living room and exhaled. "I wept here," she whispered, staring at the ceiling. "Now I own it." Chuka had 48 hours to vacate. When he returned home that evening and found Adana's name on the security log, he froze. "Adana?" he muttered, confused. She's dead." Nkechi screamed when she found the eviction letter taped to their bedroom mirror. "You let that church rat take our house?" she yelled, throwing a shoe at him. But Chuka was too stunned to speak. Her name, her handwriting, her presence. It wasn't a ghost. It was vengeance with a signature. He tried to call his lawyer, but there was no loophole. Everything was legal. The house was no longer his. That night, he sat in the parlor with a bottle of dry gin, rocking back and forth like a broken clock. Nkechi packed her bags and left without warning, calling him a cursed man. But for Adana, it wasn't about the house. It wasn't about property. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the place where she had been dehumanized. She stood at the bedroom window, touched the frame, and said, "You'll never host my silence again." Adana didn't move in. No. She had no desire to sleep in walls soaked with pain. She simply changed the locks, closed the blinds, and ordered a fumigation. The house became a symbol, a trophy of survival. She converted it into a shelter for battered women, renamed it Hope's Rest. The same kitchen that burned her would now feed women rising from ashes. The same room where she was once mocked would now hold workshops on healing and finance. She didn't announce it. She didn't post it online. Her victory was silent but total. As word spread through whispered channels, women from the church, the market, and the street began to refer to her not as the woman who got burned, but as Madam Hope. And still, she didn't speak to Chuka. Not yet. Her silence was more terrifying than 1,000 screams. She knew the time was near. But first, she had one more move to make, the one that would bury him without lifting a single hand. The plan was simple, precise, executed like a symphony. Chuka, now disoriented, penniless, and humiliated, had begun drinking himself into blackouts. His friends abandoned him. His phone rang less. His bank account grew thinner. So when a mysterious businesswoman offered him a partnership opportunity in a new interstate transport venture, he jumped at it. The meeting was set at a private suite in a hotel on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of lavender and false promises. He arrived, freshly shaved, desperate to resurrect his image. He never suspected a thing. The last thing he remembered was sipping the wine handed to him by the hotel assistant. After that, nothing. When he woke up, he was in a cold, dimly lit room. The walls were padded. The lights never turned off. There was no clock, no window, no sound beyond a soft mechanical hum, and no exit. Chuka screamed for hours. He banged on the metal door until his hands bled. No one came. There was no phone, no food tray, just silence. Eventually, a small hatch opened on the floor and a bottle of water rolled in. That was it. He drank it and waited. Then more silence. Days blurred. Time lost meaning. His body weakened. His mind began to slip. He hallucinated. Saw Dana's face laughing at him. Heard her voice reading Bible verses. He cursed her. Then wept. Then begged. But no one answered. Every 3 days, someone would slide in a plate of food, boiled yam, tasteless and dry. He was alive, but barely. One day, a voice came through a speaker. This is not death. This is reflection. We'll let you know when it's over. He collapsed in a heap, whispering, Adana, please. Outside, no one knew where he was. Not his friends. Not the church. Not even the authorities. Legally, he wasn't missing, just unreachable. His properties had been transferred. His mistress had moved on. His pastor had been disgraced. The world had moved on without him. Adana had ensured that no legal trace could lead to his location. The facility was privately owned by one of the From Grace to Grace investors. It wasn't punishment, it was preservation. Not for his benefit, but for hers. Because Chuka had once made a woman feel like she didn't deserve air, and now he lived in a world where air was all he had. Every breath reminded him of what he'd lost. And outside, Adana smiled, not in vengeance, but in victory. Not because he was suffering, but because she finally wasn't. The fall of Pastor Vincent began with a whisper, not a war. It started when one of the women from Grace to Grace uploaded a 1-minute audio clip to a private blog. In it, the voice of Pastor Vincent could be heard saying, marriage is spiritual warfare. If he hits you, pray harder. You cannot leave your ministry because of flesh wounds. The voice was clear, calm, deadly. No name was mentioned, but those who had sat under his teachings knew it. Within hours, the blog post was shared among WhatsApp groups, church networks, and women's circles. By evening, it hit social media. And by the next morning, a video emerged, grainy footage from the church's CCTV archive, showing Pastor Vincent patting Chuka on the back, while a visibly shaken Adana walked behind them. The caption? This man told her to endure until her skin peeled. The backlash was swift and vicious. Members of the church began to resign. Women who had kept quiet for years finally spoke. And a pastor once revered as a guardian of marriage was suddenly exposed as a keeper of chains. Pastor Vincent called a press conference. He sat behind a white table, clutching a Bible, trying to appear humble. His voice trembled as he said, the clip was taken out of context. I was counseling based on scripture. No one is perfect. But no one was listening. The damage was done. Female gospel singers who once shared his pulpit released statements distancing themselves. Influential pastors refused to speak in his church. Sponsors pulled out from the church's new school project. And beneath the surface, Pastor Vincent's health began to decline. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He started seeing Adana's face in every quiet moment. Not angry, not violent. Just staring, disappointed. The same face he ignored when she came to him bruised. He tried to call her. Her number didn't connect. He even visited her old house, only to be told, she owns it now, sir. It's a shelter for abused women. That was the final blow. The very home she used to crawl through in pain now served as a sanctuary of power. And he, the man who once told her to kneel and bleed, had become a footnote in her redemption. But Adana didn't gloat. She didn't tweet. Didn't go on live TV. She simply instructed her lawyer to release one final clip, a private counseling session between herself and Pastor Vincent, recorded just after her miscarriage. In it, she could be heard crying, saying, he beat the baby out of me. And Vincent replied, "It's a test of your womanhood." Sarah waited. "So must you." The clip went viral within hours. National news carried it. Activists marched to the church gates. And in a single weekend, the mighty altar of Pastor Vincent crumbled. Adana watched the coverage from her quiet home, sipping tea. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted truth. And now the world finally saw it, not just her scars, but the silence that enabled them. It wasn't just Chuka who tried to break her. It was the pulpit too. And she had burned them both with nothing but light. Nkechi's downfall was not loud. It was slow, bitter, and served on a plate of poetic irony. After abandoning Chuka, when the house was repossessed, she moved in with a new man, Kingsley, a fast-talking real estate agent with broad shoulders and a short temper. He was charming at first, showering her with gifts and promises of marriage. Nkechi believed she had finally found her upgrade. But within a month, Kingsley began to show his true self. He had a habit of locking her in the bathroom whenever he was angry. He once slapped her so hard she chipped a tooth. Another time, he poured palm oil on her clothes because she spoke to another man at a party. She tried to run, but he tracked her down, dragged her by her braids through the compound, and tossed her into the apartment like a sack of rice. No one helped, just as no one had helped Adana. Karma, it seemed, didn't use knives, it used mirrors. Nkechi began to change. The makeup faded. Her nails broke. Her friends stopped picking her calls. Her Instagram went silent. She had become what she once mocked, silent, ashamed, and trapped. She remembered Adana then, the quiet woman she laughed at, the woman who brought her chilled drinks while she disrespected her in her own home. Guilt crawled up her spine like a ghost. She wanted to apologize, but didn't know where to start. One night, Kingsley beat her so badly that she collapsed on the bathroom floor and woke up in the hospital. The nurses were cold. The doctor asked, "Did he do this?" And she lied, "I fell." But they knew. Everyone knew. The same way everyone once knew Adana was suffering, but chose to look away. That was the cruelty of it. Truth didn't need to scream. It only needed to wait. A friend of Nkechi's, who was now part of From Grace to Grace, sent Adana a video of Nkechi being dragged by her wig at a fuel station. Her face was swollen, her blouse torn. "Should I delete this?" the friend asked. Adana stared at the video for a long time. Her face showed no emotion. Then she said, "Yes. Let it go." And it was done. She didn't want Nkechi destroyed. That would be too easy. She wanted her to understand, to feel, to remember. And she had, deeply. Nkechi now walked the same path Adana had once crawled, only with less grace, fewer allies, and no hope. She had laughed at a woman who prayed. Now, even prayer wouldn't find her. Adana didn't rejoice. She simply whispered, "That is enough," and moved on. Because the true victory wasn't in seeing her enemy fall. It was in walking past their ruins without needing to pause. Adana sat behind a mahogany desk in her lawyer's office, flipping through a folder of land titles, company documents, and shareholding agreements. Everything Chuka once claimed to own was now under her legal name. Piece by piece, silently, her empire had absorbed his. The house in Enugu, the warehouse in Succa, the rental flats in Oka, even his father's ancestral land, which Chuka had secretly mortgaged to cover debts, now bore her name due to default. She hadn't used force. No gunmen, no threats, just paperwork, patience, and precision. The same systems that once failed her had now bent in her favor. She had mastered the law, paid the right consultants, studied the loopholes. And now, the man who beat her for praying was nothing more than a signature she once carried. "Congratulations," her lawyer said. "He has nothing left." She smiled slightly. "Except time. Let him reflect." Word began to spread in social circles. Bankers whispered. Past clients nodded. Madam Hope was not just a survivor. She was now a player. One of the fastest rising female property moguls in the Southeast. Investors begged for meetings. Journalists begged for interviews. But she turned them all down. She didn't want fame. She wanted control. And now she had it. One afternoon, The same lawyer who once refused to take her abuse case came to her office seeking investment for a failing firm. He didn't recognize her at first, until she removed her glasses. "Adana," he gasped. "Yes," she replied. "But you can call me Ma now." He stammered apologies. She waved him off. "It's not personal, just business." And with that, she signed the papers that made her a majority shareholder in his practice. Her victory wasn't loud. It was clinical. But even with all this power, Adana remained grounded. She still wore modest gowns, still spoke softly, still prayed. Only now, the prayers were different. She no longer asked for deliverance. She thanked God for revelation, for wisdom, for strength. And she never forgot the women who helped her rise. She donated part of her profits to From Grace to Grace, ensuring more women had access to lawyers, therapists, and emergency housing. She created something Chuka never could, legacy. And, in doing so, she finally felt peace. Not because her scars disappeared, but because her story had evolved. Her body bore evidence of fire, but her name, her voice, her future, they now bore evidence of triumph. She had taken back everything, not with revenge, but with readiness, not with shouting, but with silence that made even the strongest men tremble. The first Sunday Adana returned to church was not a triumphant procession. It was a storm in silence. She arrived quietly in a long flowing white gown, her face veiled in a soft net of silver lace. She did not walk through the back door like she used to. This time she entered through the center aisle, accompanied by two women from Grace to Grace. The congregation, stunned into hush, turned to stare. A few gasped. Others whispered, poking each other and pointing in disbelief. The woman they believed had died. The woman they once called weak had returned transformed. But it was not her outfit that unsettled them. It was her presence, the calmness, the stillness, the power that now radiated from someone they used to pity. Even Pastor Vincent, who stood frozen behind the pulpit, fumbled with his Bible, sweat gathering beneath his collar. The choir continued singing, but their voices faltered as Adana moved closer to the altar. She didn't go up. She simply walked to the front row and placed an envelope on the altar. Then she turned around and sat down, silent, regal, unbothered. After the service, people lined up trying to speak to her. Some stuttered apologies. Some cried. Some just wanted to touch her hand. But she said very little, until Pastor Vincent, avoiding her eyes, approached and said, "Sister Adana, it is good to see you again." She removed her veil slowly and said, "You saw me before, Pastor. You just chose not to see what was bleeding." His lips parted, but no words came. She handed him a folded letter. It was a personal statement, sealed and signed, with documentation of every conversation they had during her abuse, copies of donation records used to silence her pain, and screenshots of the messages he ignored. The pastor crumpled slightly as he held it, his hands trembling. "It's not for vengeance," she said. "It's for remembrance. So you never let silence protect evil again." That evening, Adana's donation, Nigerian naira 10 million, was officially acknowledged during the church's financial report. But it came with a condition, a clause attached to the letter, demanding the establishment of a women's support committee with real legal and spiritual intervention programs, led by independent women from outside the church's board. Pastor Vincent, still reeling from public backlash, had no choice but to agree. The same church that once praised endurance was now forced to teach boundaries. The message was clear. Adana wasn't there to reclaim pews. She was there to rewrite doctrine. The women watched her in awe. Many wept quietly. And by the time she left the sanctuary, nothing felt the same. Not the sermons, not the rituals, not the faith. Because when a woman who was once buried walks in unbroken, even angels take notice. Adana didn't look back. She simply whispered, "Let God arise," and left the church in the silence it had earned. The room Chuka was held in had no clocks, but time still passed. It passed in the screams he shouted to no one, in the scratches he left on the walls, in the diary pages he wrote with charcoal from the vents. His beard had grown wild, his nails dirty, his eyes sunken. The arrogance that once made him tower over others had collapsed into a man who mumbled apologies to shadows. He spent most of his days staring at the tiny vent in the corner, hoping to hear footsteps, any human sound. But no one came. No lawyer. No Nkechi. No Pastor Vincent. Just him and his breath. And in that breath, regret took root. He replayed every slap, every insult, every time Adana knelt in prayer and he mocked her. He saw her tears as clearly as his reflection in the steel walls. Adana, he would mutter, crawling to the door, pressing his face to the cold metal. I'm sorry. Please. Just talk to me. But she never did. The voice that once whispered scriptures was now unreachable. And in that silence, Chuka's mind turned on itself. He began hallucinating. He saw her face on the ceiling, smiling not in rage, but in disappointment. He heard the boiling kettle, the crash of the tray, the whimper of her voice as he poured pain onto her skin. And he saw the younger version of himself, confident, loved, admired, fade into a creature who now begged for the light. He began to write, on the back of toilet paper, on the floor with his fingernails, on the walls with dust. I was wrong. I was wicked. I was blind. It became a mantra. But still no one came. He was fed twice a day through a hatch. A camera watched him constantly. And the speaker sometimes buzzed, but never spoke. His tormentor was silence. The very silence he once demanded of his wife. Then one day, a letter came through the hatch. One single page. No name. No threats. Just a sentence. You took her voice. Now hear nothing. He broke. He cried for hours, screaming her name into the vent, hoping she'd answer. She didn't. He ripped the mattress, tore his shirt, begged the walls to become human. But all he heard was the hum of the AC and the sound of his own insanity. The man who once silenced a woman now lived in a world with no echoes. And it was then he understood, not just what he lost, but what he never deserved. Love. Grace. A second chance. He curled into himself that night and whispered her name over and over again like a prayer he no longer had the right to pray. But even prayers need mercy, and mercy had moved on. Adana's name became a quiet wave that reshaped conversations in boardrooms, salons, and homes. She didn't go on TV. She didn't host empowerment seminars. She didn't start a talk show. But women whispered her story like gospel. The one they burned came back and bought the house. The woman who turned a scar into a signature. Her business flourished. She opened her third warehouse in ABA. Her farm exports hit international markets. She was invited to speak at a women's conference in Abuja, but declined. Instead, she sent a statement. Let every woman remember, silence is not holiness. You can pray and still walk away. The quote went viral. Influencers, journalists, and spiritual leaders debated her words. Some applauded, others questioned. But Adana didn't care for their opinions. Her goal was never applause, it was awakening. And she had achieved it. One quiet revolution at a time. She expanded from grace to grace discreetly, funding a legal hotline for abused wives, paying for emergency medical procedures, and sponsoring entrepreneurial training for young girls. She never attached her name publicly. But those in the system knew. Madam Hope was the hand behind the light. At a university seminar, a professor referenced her case, without naming names, as a classic study of feminine rebirth. Students wrote essays about her. A documentary producer requested her story rights. She refused. This isn't for entertainment, she said. It's for liberation. Yet, beneath all the power, she remained humble. She still wore minimal makeup, still greeted cleaners by name, still ended her meetings with a soft thank you. But her eyes, those were different now. They no longer begged to be seen. They commanded recognition. Because Adana was no longer trying to survive. She was leading, quietly, unapologetically. One day, while walking through a new property she was acquiring, she paused and looked at her reflection in the glass. The scar across her left cheek had faded slightly, but remained visible. She didn't flinch. didn't turn away. She touched it gently and smiled. "You're not my shame," she whispered. "You're my seal." And in that moment, the journey came full circle. From ashes to honor, from prayer to power, from silence to speech. Adana had become what she once prayed for, a woman who didn't just believe in miracles, but became one. She still remembered the boiling water, the screams, the betrayal. But now, those memories were no longer chains. They were bricks. And she had built something eternal with them, something no fire could destroy. Her name was no longer a footnote in a man's biography. It was now a story of its own. The paperwork was thicker than expected. Documents spanning over 70 pages, each one representing a piece of the last act in Adana's redemption story. With a calm hand and a sharper mind, she signed the final form, an indefinite psychiatric custody petition. It was not vengeance. It was law. It was strategy. Chuka, now listed as psychologically unfit, could not be released from the private facility without her written consent, something she had no intention of ever giving. The man who once caged her spirit now lived in a world where he couldn't speak to anyone without approval. She had kept everything legal, transparent, documented. There would be no accusations of extrajudicial action. The judge, unaware of the full history, simply nodded when her lawyer presented the evidence of his erratic behavior, self-harm, and long isolation. Approval for long-term observation granted, the judge declared. And just like that, the door behind Chuka didn't just lock, it disappeared. Outside the courtroom, the media waited. They didn't know the full story. They speculated, whispered, theorized about why a once powerful businessman had vanished. Some suspected bankruptcy. Others claimed he fled the country. A few even suggested suicide. But Adana said nothing. She simply stepped into her black Prado SUV and drove away. Inside her bag was a final letter, never to be mailed, addressed to Chuka. It read, "You once said I talked too much. I hope the silence has been loud enough." She folded the letter, placed it in her journal, and closed the book on that chapter of her life. Nuguonbis. No final conversations. Just closure delivered not in words, but in action. And as she drove past the estate where they once lived, she felt nothing. No nostalgia. No regret. Just a soft exhale. The street lamps flickered as she passed, as if nodding in agreement. The woman who once begged for mercy had become the keeper of justice. Back at home, her staff celebrated her birthday quietly. No extravagant balloons. No paparazzi. Just a garden table filled with fruits, fresh flowers, and soft music. Chioma from Grace to Grace gifted her a framed quote that read, "Some women don't wait for the door to open. They become the storm that breaks it down." Adana smiled and hugged her. Later that night, she sat alone in her study, staring at the stars. She thought about all the women who had died praying, the ones buried with bruises, the ones told by pastors to kneel until they could no longer stand. And she whispered a vow, "Not on my watch again." That night, she didn't dream about pain. She dreamt of a house filled with laughter, women dancing, children safe. And in the center of it all, herself, not bleeding or pleading, but standing tall, holding the very keys that once locked her away. It was the annual Women's Empowerment Summit in Lagos, an event attended by senators, business moguls, survivors, and global advocates. Adana had declined the invitation 3 years in a row, but this time she accepted, not because she wanted the applause, but because the silence needed a face. She arrived wearing a flowing emerald gown that kissed the ground with every step. Her hair was swept into a low bun, her jewelry minimal, but her presence was electric. As she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Many recognized her. Few had seen her speak. The host, a famous media personality, stood beside her and whispered, "Take your time." Adana nodded, walked to the podium, and paused. Then she slowly removed her scarf, revealing the scar that still marked the left side of her face. There were audible gasps. A few hands covered mouths. But Adana didn't flinch. "This scar," she began, her voice clear and grounded, "was not just caused by hot water. It was caused by silence, by culture, by doctrine, by fear dressed in scripture. The room hung on every word. I stayed because I believed God hated divorce more than he hated violence. I stayed because I was told to fast through pain. I stayed because I was taught that endurance is holiness. But I learned, too late for my womb, but not too late for my life, that God doesn't want you to die proving loyalty to someone who wouldn't spit on you if you were on fire. There was a stillness in the air, thick with emotion. Many women wept openly. A few men bowed their heads in shame. I didn't leave with fists. I left with vision. And today, I'm not here because I survived. I'm here because I chose to thrive. Thunderous applause erupted. People stood, cheered, sobbed. But Adana didn't cry. She just smiled gently and stepped back from the mic. After her speech, she exited the stage and went outside. The night breeze kissed her cheeks as she stared at the sky. One of the younger girls from the audience followed her out. She couldn't have been more than 18. "Ma," she said, eyes shining with tears, "you gave me courage." Adana turned to her and replied, "No, dear. I just reminded you that you already had it." That night, as she drove home, she passed a church billboard that read, "Women, submit to your husbands in everything." She didn't feel anger. She just shook her head. "Not anymore," she whispered. At home, she stood before the mirror. The scar was still there. But now it wasn't a mark of shame. It was a seal of strength. She touched it one last time and said, "You spoke when I couldn't. Thank you." And for the first time in a long time, she slept soundly. No nightmares. No prayers in pain. Just peace, the kind that comes when a woman finally reclaims her name, her power, and her voice. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.